So hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the final April Fulcis event about Don't Torture a Duckling with our guest speaker tonight, Troy Howarth. I'll come back to the film and to Troy here in just a minute. But as I like to do while people are still logging on, I will introduce myself and the film series. My name is Pete Timmerman. I'm the director of the film series. The Webster University Film Series is St. Louis's only year-round nonprofit cinema. Let me see. Here we go. I do that every time. Um, we've been in operation for about 42 years now. We show both new and repertory art house films, international films, and we do classics, we do new restorations, things like that. We haven't shown anything in person since March of last year. When we do show things in person, it's in the Winifred Moore Auditorium, which is in Webster Hall on Webster University's main campus in St. Louis, Missouri. We're expecting to return to in-person programming in August, but that's subject to change either way. August is just kind of what we're vaguely shooting for. But for now, we're hosting what we call a virtual cinema. This event that you're attending at the moment is part of the virtual cinema. We do a lot of these virtual speaker events, but also we have movies in the virtual cinema. So at the moment, we have two, Downstream to Kinshasa and Hope. Tonight is the last night that Hope is available to rent, but if you do pull the trigger and rent Hope tonight, you'll get a full 72 hours to watch it. It costs $12 to rent, and we get half the proceeds. The distributor gets the other half. But it's a new film. It's a Norwegian-Swedish co-production. It was Norway's submission to the Academy for the Best International Feature Oscar this year. And then you've got one more week on Downstream to Kinshasa, which is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's a new documentary about Adiodo Hamadi, who he was the featured filmmaker at the True Falls Film Festival in 2018. He won the True Vision Award, but Downstream to Kinshasa is the first new film he's made since then. And then starting tomorrow, Friday, April 30th, we are adding the new adaptation of Berlin Alexanderplatz. It's a German film. It's about 3 hours long, which makes it about 12 hours shorter than the Fassbinder version from 40 years ago. I don't know how to pronounce the director's name, so I'm not going to butcher it now. But yeah, it's still episodic. So if you were to rent the new Berlin Alexanderplatz, but you didn't have 3 hours to watch it all in one shot, it's broken up into 5 parts. So you can treat it like binge watching a show and watch it all at once, or you can. It is a movie. It wasn't intended as a miniseries or anything like that, but it is pretty easy to break up into more digestible chunks if you have trouble breaking 3 hours out of your day. So secondly, I wanted to thank our sponsors of the April Fulcis event. Our events, we have 2 sponsors. The first is Messed Up Puzzles. Messed Up Puzzles gets the rights to artwork for a lot of the types of films that we've been celebrating lately and turns them into puzzles, 1,000-piece puzzles. You can access their shop at messeduppuzzles.com, and that's also their handle on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, Messed Up Puzzles. But anyway, as part of the April Fulcis series, we're going to give away 2 Messed Up Puzzles. Anybody that's picked to win can just choose any in-stock Fulci puzzle. So unless things change rapidly, like in the next 24 hours or so, your options are the New York Ripper, Zombie, and the Beyond. And we'll pull those winners hopefully tomorrow. I'm hoping to do it tomorrow morning. So I'm going to notify the winners that they were pulled to win a puzzle or a book, as I'll get to in a minute. I'll notify you via the email that you registered to attend these events. So keep an eye on that email, especially within the next 24 hours. Our other sponsor is Left Bank Books in St. Louis. They're in the Central West End. They've been an independent bookstore in the St. Louis area since 1969. We've partnered with them since at least 1985, the film series and Left Bank Books, but they have a landing page to where our speakers for the April Fulcis series, they collected all their books in one spot. So if you go to left-bank.com and then go to events and book clubs, you'll find Webster University Film Series, April Fulcis. Then you scroll to the bottom. We've got Kia Wilson's book, which we've got 1 copy of to give away. So again, we'll notify the winner tomorrow. Kia's book is 20% off for a few more days. If you wanted to get it from Left Bank, get 20% off. I don't have an exact end date, but within about a week or so, I think that's going to end. We've got a couple of books from Aaron Christensen, Dr. AC, who spoke in week 2. And then we've got 1 book featured from Troy Howarth, our speaker tonight. That's the bio of Lucio Fulci. But of course, if you click on Troy's name, you get a whole mess of stuff. Troy's written a whole lot of books. This is page 1 of 2, I will note. But yeah, so that's a good place to look at all of Troy's books, many of which will relate at least somewhat to what we're talking about tonight. Splintered Visions, the one that we most want to highlight, but the So Deadly, So Perverse series is also relevant here. Let me unshare my screen. Okay. So, like I said, tonight is the last night of April Fulcis. Next week, we're going to start a series on Satoshi Kon, the Japanese animator who died at the age of 46 he was battling pancreatic cancer. He made 4 feature films, and we're going to look at each of the 4 films over the Thursdays in May. Our speaker next week specifically is a PhD student at WashU in Japanese literature named Adam Manfredi. I actually haven't met him yet. I might be mispronouncing his name. I think it's Adam Manfredi, though. But we'll have him next week. Just a few more thoughts before I turn the floor over to Troy and his cat Wookie. We have a new YouTube page. So if you had wanted to attend any of our previous events, we started these in February with Rainer Werner Fassbinder, then we did Sofia Coppola in March, and now we're doing Lucio Fulci, clearly. If you wanted to attend any of these events and missed them, or if you wanted to go back and watch ones that you liked or anything like that, you'll find them on our YouTube page. If you just on YouTube search for Webster University Film Series, our channel will be the first thing that comes up. And lastly, after Troy does a presentation, we're going to have space for a Q&A with the audience. I have some questions prepared, but I always like to hear audience questions more. So don't be shy about putting your questions in. The best place to put them is down in the bottom. If you click on Q&A, it'll open up the Q&A box, and we'll get to those when Troy's main presentation is over. But then that brings me to Troy. Troy I don't even know how to introduce you. You've had so many things. I already showed you the list of the several pages of books that Troy has authored, including Splintered Visions, the biography of Lucio Fulci. You, in the lead up, as people were logging in, I don't know how many of you saw, but we were talking about audio commentaries that Troy has recorded. He's at over 100 total now, including something like 10 Fulci films. But if you get the Blue Underground release of Zombie, or the Blue Underground release of House by the Cemetery, or the Arrow release of tonight's film, Don't Torture Duckling, there's an audio commentary from Troy Howarth, who is speaking here tonight. But we're very lucky and happy to have him, and I will get out of the way and let Troy take the floor. So thank you very much, Troy.
Well, thank you. And I wanted to thank Pete and Aaron Obashan for being kind enough to ask me to come and talk about one of my favorite topics, one of my favorite filmmakers, somebody that I think it's fair to say for years was reviled as a imitative hack, somebody who just reveled in scenes of violence for their own sake and didn't really have much in the way of story construction sense or character sense or cared anything about actors and so forth. I'm here to try to dispel some of these notions, give you a little bit of background about Fulci and about this particular film, and also the context in which this film was made, which is very important. So, as Pete already said, I am the author of Splintered Visions, Lucio Fulci and his films, which is a attempt to kind of come to grips with the very diverse and very eclectic filmography of Lucio Fulci. This is a man who, oh dear, my friend Wookie is leaving me. We're off to a bad start. Lucio Fulci is lionized and revered in some circles and very much criticized in other circles for a series of very gory horror films that he made in the early 1980s through the end of his career. There's a lot more to him than that. And so just by way of a little bit of Fulci background, he was born in 1927 in Rome, came from a very comfortable sort of middle-class environment. And significantly, and I say this with a knowledge of the fact that Fulci has a reputation for being a dyed-in-the-wool misogynist. He was actually raised in an environment with very strong women. His father was not part of the picture. His father sort of left the scene whenever he was little. And so he was raised primarily by his mother and his grandmother. So he had a background of dealing with women who were a very significant and very important part of his life. And indeed, later on as well, there were a variety of personal tragedies and various failed relationships and so forth. But he also had 2 daughters that were very significant in his life. So the Fulci as misogynist angle is something we won't get into in terribly deep detail unless others want to ask me about it later on. But it's certainly something that it doesn't just affect him in terms of his reputation. It's something that a lot of filmmakers in this particular genre get hit with a lot because there are a lot of tropes that are obviously rather sexist and so forth that can sometimes spoil the enjoyment of some of these films, depending on your point of view. But I think if you look at Fulci's films in their entirety and give them a more sympathetic and more depthy kind of look, you'll see that his treatment of women is actually much more complex than that. And I think that's certainly the case with the movie that we're here to talk about today, Don't Torture a Duckling. Politically, like many of the filmmakers of his period, he was very leftist. He identified as a Marxist. And in fact, he started off not to be a filmmaker at all. He started off to be a doctor. He was actually in medical school. And the story goes that he loved telling was that he was in a relationship at that time with a woman who was less than impressed with his bank account. And so he ended up dropping out of med school in order to try and impress her, went into movies. And the story goes that later on, he was working on a film as an assistant director. There was a very elegant looking Rolls Royce that pulled up when they were on location at the Piazza del Popolo, and out steps this very beautiful woman. You guessed it, the woman that Fulci had previously been involved with. He went over to her, arms outstretched, and she put a coin in his hand. She thought he was a beggar. So he said, yes, that was my introduction to the cinema. It did not go the way that he expected it to. And it was a tormented career in some respects. It was a very difficult career that progressed in fits and spurts. Started off as an assistant director, got into writing as a screenwriter, and he made his film debut as a director in 1959. That's a full 20 years before he becomes known as a director of horror films with the production of Zombie, which obviously you saw as part of this series of Fulci films. Arguably, probably his most iconic film, if not his best, although it is a very fine piece of work. But interestingly, what a lot of people I don't think are either aware of or particularly care to learn about is that for the first several years of his career, he focused primarily on comedies and musicals, if you can believe it. And Fulci was also an accomplished lyricist. He actually had some success contributing lyrics to various songs. So, kind of an eclectic career, a very interesting background, very intellectual, very well read. And these are not necessarily things that one would necessarily assume based on the types of films that he made later on. But he was very much a provocateur. He loved to do things that would shock, do things that would grab the audience. So the first sign of any kind of real violent leanings in his movies doesn't come until 1965 when he makes a film called Massacre Time, also known as The Brute and the Beast. That's a spaghetti western, first of 3 spaghetti westerns he directed, which starred Franco Nero, who around that same time also became a major star thanks to Django. Of course, he also ended up going off to Hollywood and making some films there, and for a period of time was a major international superstar. So his first movie that really kind of indicated the turn towards the macabre and towards the obsession with violence and the obsession with essentially sort of what kind of punishment the body can take. And I think some of that is due to his background in medicine. I honestly do. I think that somehow or another, there was that sort of lingering fascination with the body and how it works and everything else. And it's kind of like dissecting a corpse in an anatomy class. He stages the sequence where the body is kind of torn apart limb from limb and in loving, gory detail in a way that very few people would do. Massacre Time obviously isn't as bloody as something like Zombie or The Beyond, both of which you would have seen as part of this series. But it does have some very violent and sort of psychosexual stuff going on in it that's very interesting. It's certainly a film that's well worth seeking. And I'm happy to say there is a Blu-ray release coming from Arrow Video, I believe, or one of the other labels, I should say. I should say it was Arrow Video, but there is no, it's actually a German, I apologize, a German Blu-ray release that is available. So if you're interested in Massacre Time, do by all means check that out. It is a film that's well worth seeing. But this is 1965. There's still several years of sort of dabbling in and out of different types of genres, and it isn't until 1969 that he makes his first giallo. Now, the giallo is something that deserves some discussion, and by way of a little bit of giallo 101, because it's certainly a subject that's very close to my heart, something that I'm very interested in. It's a term that deserves some explaining, though, because it's obviously, if you're not into these movies already, you're not going to know what I'm talking about. So giallo, specifically, the term means yellow in Italian. And the reason for that was there was a series of paperback lurid mystery thrillers that were put out by a company called Mondadori in Italy. And they were all distinguished by the fact that they had these yellow covers. And so these stories all became known as giallo or gialli, gialli being the plural version. So it basically encompasses all kinds of different mystery stories, whether it's classical murder mysteries in the style of Agatha Christie and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or getting into tougher, more noir edge type things like Raymond Chandler and things like that. So in literary terms, it's very all encompassing. But in terms of the cinema, it denotes a very specific type of thriller. It is obviously Italian, or at least primarily Italian. That's something we'll come back to in a moment, because the financing of these movies gets a little bit muddy and can kind of get a little confusing at times. But basically, they're essentially Italian films, lurid, usually with an emphasis on either violence or some sort of psychosexual obsessiveness. So, as I was saying before, Fulci's first foray into this type of film came in 1969. It was a movie called Perversion Story, also known as One on Top of the Other. Not a violent film at all. It is one of these sort of sexual giallo films, the sexy gialli that proliferated in the late 1960s. But the giallo on film really began in 1963 with the release of a film by Mario Bava called The Girl Who Knew Too Much. The Girl Who Knew Too Much was released in America under the title of Evil Eye, in a very compromised, re-edited version, rescored, and heavily revised to make it into effectively a very different film for the American market. As you can guess from the original Italian title, The Girl Who Knew Too Much, it's a kind of a spoof of Alfred Hitchcock thrillers. But it's the first one of these Italian thrillers that has that kind of lurid, sort of pulp fiction kind of quality to it that is very significant in terms of the giallo in its style, in terms of its thematic leanings and so forth. It's a rather lighthearted film. It's certainly not as violent as the movies that would follow, but it's that first step towards the creation of this very specific Italian style of thriller. There were indeed thrillers made in Italy, mystery films and thrillers made in Italy before this movie, but this is accepted by most people as kind of the starting point of this very specific genre. So Mario Bava, of course, he makes that film. Afterwards, he makes an anthology film called The Girl Knew Too Much, obviously not that. The Three Faces of Fear, which was released in America as Black Sabbath. Some of you may know that film. It starred Boris Karloff. And one of the segments it contains, it's an anthology film, and one of the segments is a story called The Telephone, which is pretty much effectively the first color giallo. If you see the Italian version and see the American version, there's some very significant changes. It was very adult in its content and in its tone in the Italian version, whereas it's watered down in the American version. And that's significant because in American culture, effectively, especially at that time, horror films were treated very much as matinee fare for kids. They were seen as movies that weren't to be taken seriously. They were made for children. Whereas in Europe, these films were forbidden to children. They were made for adult audiences. So it's not surprising, therefore, that the Italian films, the British films and so forth tend to have a much more serious tone compared to some of the stuff that, say, like Roger Corman or certainly William Castle was doing in the US. But the Italian version is much more serious. It deals with things like prostitution and lesbianism and all kinds of things that were sort of lurid themes for the period that would not be appropriate for a kiddie matinee audience that was there to see the latest Boris Karloff monster movie. So, of course, it was changed pretty substantially for US release. You see the original Italian version, which is available from Arrow Video and also from Kino in the US. It is a much, much stronger film. But anyway, from there, he does another film called Blood and Black Lace, which it pretty much effectively sets the stage for the body count giallo films. Now, this is the type of film that I think most people identify as a giallo. And it is the movie where you have a killer dressed in black, usually with a black fedora, some sort of face covering, and of course, the all-important black leather gloves, going around committing vicious murders in a very stylized and beautifully photographed kind of milieu. Blood and Black Lace was a total commercial bust in Italy. It was not successful at all, though it was exported. It did very well in the US. It did well in other countries. But Italian audiences didn't tend to respond well to Mario Bava's films in general, or to the whole kind of Italian horror and thriller films in general. And the
Mhm.
reason for that, at least theoretically, was the fact that because Italy is such a sunny, bucolic country, even though it has its history of violence, no question, but it has this romantic kind of very aesthetic quality to it. Italian audiences seem to feel as if the idea of an Italian filmmaker making films of this kind was sort of ridiculous. And so they tended to avoid these movies. Whereas they tended to be embraced much more so in America, Great Britain, France, Germany, and so forth. But regardless, from there's more Giallo films that come out in the 60s, but the one that actually kind of triggers off a little mini boom is a movie by Romola Guerrieri from 1968 called The Sweet Body of Deborah, a movie that's very indebted to the great Henri-Georges Clouzot thriller Les Diaboliques from the 1950s. Les Diaboliques served as the model for a lot of Giallo films in the late 60s and early 70s, including Fulci's Perversion story. So if you're familiar with Diabolique and you know that Diabolique is kind of the model for these films, it kind of gives you an idea of what to expect with these movies. They're not blood and gore fests, but they tend to be a little bit kinky. They tend to be a little bit sort of psychosexual, and they very often deal with the theme of a psychologically fragile protagonist who's being psychologically manipulated by amoral villains who are looking to get a hold of property, money, or whatever. That film surprisingly did end up being successful, and again, Sweet Body of Deborah triggered this little mini boom of Diabolique style thrillers. But the big smash hit that came was in February of 1970. Dario Argento, a film critic turned screenwriter and eventually turned film director, made his first movie, a film called The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which some of you may be familiar with. If Lucio Fulci is not necessarily a name that's revered in mainstream circles, Argento has had a more, let's say, more warm embrace in some respects by the mainstream. He's certainly enjoyed a degree of terrific success through the 1980s, although his recent films have not been nearly as warmly embraced, and sometimes quite deservedly so, I'd argue. But regardless, Bird with the Crystal Plumage was his first film. Comes out in February of 1970, was not an immediate box office smash, but gradually through good word of mouth becomes a big hit. And what ends up happening, if you're familiar with the Italian principle of the Filoni meaning stream, basically a particular movie comes out, it does really well, and then there's a bunch of other movies that are made that are cash-ins. They're designed to be very much along the same lines. Michael Winner makes Death Wish, and all of a sudden we have all these Italian Death Wish style movies that come out. Don Siegel makes Dirty Harry, and all of a sudden we have all these Italian rogue cop movies, the Poliziotteschi films that were very successful in the early 70s. Dario Argento set off a similar trend with Bird with the Crystal Plumage. And the end result of that was that a genre that up until that time had not been particularly hugely successful in the years 1971, 72, and 73, there is a huge glut of Giallo films that are made. 1972, the year that Don't Torture Duckling comes out, for example, there were no less than 33 Giallo films put out in Italian cinemas. That's a pretty sizable number of movies, I'm sure you would agree, although in fairness, compared to the spaghetti Western, not really that impressive. I mean, certainly the spaghetti Western was a bigger, more successful trend in some respects. But for a period of time, really, I'd argue, say around 71 to 73, things really got cooking. And not only were there a lot of Giallo films that were being made, there were a lot of Giallo films being made with really strange titles. And that obviously brings us to Don't Torture a Duckling, as well as the Giallo film that Fulci made before this, the equally baroquely titled A Lizard in a Woman's Skin. What do these titles have in common? Well, obviously, they all sort of name check some sort of an animal or an insect. Dario Argento had made The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, The Cat o' Nine Tails, and Four Flies in Grey Velvet. So then you have Riccardo Freda making Iguana with the Tongue of Fire, Lucio Fulci doing Don't Torture a Duckling and Lizard in a Woman's Skin, Paolo Cavara making Black Belly of the Tarantula, and so forth and so on. A lot of these titles are certainly eye-catching. I know that if I were standing outside of a theater, well, pre-COVID, of course, standing outside of a theater thinking about what I wanted to see, I'd want to see movies with titles like that. But we don't have that sense of value nowadays, so titles are kind of boring. But but it did result in a ton of movies that were being made, many of which, quite frankly, weren't all that great. Some of them are movies that have really interesting highlights, some really good, cool sequences, almost invariably great soundtracks. Um, but stories that are a little, they're not necessarily the best. And certainly, if you're looking for logic, especially where the title is concerned, I refer you to Freda's Iguana with the Tongue of Fire if you really want a kind of head scratching moment. Listen to the explanation of the title in that film. I'm not going to go into it here because it's actually vaguely offensive, but it is completely preposterous. And the whole idea, of course, was to just keep cashing in as much as possible on these other films that had been successful, namely Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Dario Argento, of course, was none too pleased by this. And for a period of time, he tried to get away from making giallo films himself. He felt as though everybody was stealing his thunder. And specifically, he was very unhappy with Lucio Fulci. That particular relationship, we don't really need to get into too much here, but suffice it to say, it was a two-way street. Fulci was a notoriously outspoken person in interviews. He was notoriously volatile. He liked to shock people. He was an extremely well-read, very well-educated, very cultured man, but he loved being blasphemous. He loved being vulgar. And this was something that if people were on the same wavelength with him and they appreciated it, they got a kick out of it, they got along with him just fine. But if they didn't like it, things could get very difficult. And Fulci was not one for holding back his opinion. And he would often say in interviews unpleasant things about Dario Argento and his films. Argento, to his credit, not being quite as brusque as Fulci, as few people were, didn't really comment about Fulci in public too much. But, it was known that there was a little bit of a rivalry there for a period of time, certainly by the early 80s, when Fulci has become known as kind of the crown prince of Italian horror films. Dario Argento, of course, was the commercial king, no question about it. But for a period of time, Fulci was really giving him a run for his money, making these films on much tighter budgets, much shorter schedules, with much less in the way of resources. And this kind of gets into some of the nature of the difficulty between the two men, in the sense that Argento came from a background that was pretty affluent. His father was a film producer, and because his father was a film producer, he had an obvious in. He had an advantage. His father produced his early films, and so there was a lot of resentment on the part of old, experienced kind of warhorse directors, including Fulci. I mean, who wasn't that much older than Argento, but had been at it since 1959. A little bit of resentment at the idea of this, sort of snot-nosed kid coming in and making films with his dad producing them, and obviously having advantages that they didn't have. So there was a little bit of a kind of a schism there for a period of time. But suffice it to say, Fulci, until the release of Zombie 1979, 1980, is not known as a horror guy at all. He's been directing films for 20 years. And during that period of time, he's made a really interesting, eclectic array of films. And that's one of the reasons that I actually favor him over Argento, as much as I love Argento. Argento has specialized very specifically, with the exception of one film that is very much outside of the sort of horror suspense genre, a kind of political movie that he made in the early 70s called The 5 Days, which was a movie that he made specifically because he was tired of everybody stealing his thunder with the giallo films and so forth. So he decided to try something else. Everything else kind of fits into the horror suspense sort of genre. And he's always specialized. Fulci did a little bit of everything, and importantly, he did it all very well. And that is one of the big reasons that I thought, when I was approached to do this talk, which hopefully I'm not boring you too badly with, I thought it was very important that, knowing that the other films were going to be films like Zombie, The Gates of Hell, or City of the Living Dead, whichever title you prefer, House by the Cemetery, and the Beyond, the big popular films, I wanted to make sure and show something that was outside of that group, to give you an idea of what he was capable of doing away from that context. Because if you only watch those films from the early 80s, you might have a very limited, kind of narrow view of what he was like. Personally, having seen all of his films, having written about all of his films, I think it's very important to give as much time as you're willing to to exploring all of the different kinds of genres that he dabbled in. You may not want to watch all of his comedies, but you should see probably at least one or two of them. And the same goes with his westerns. He only did three, and all three of them were quite good. And various other genres that he's worked in as well. So he's a filmmaker of tremendous, again, eclectic interests. He is a working filmmaker. So that gets us into the whole question of the auteur theory and so forth and so on. The auteur theory, of course, is very controversial. I think it has merit. I think it has value. I think it works, but you can't apply it to every single filmmaker. You can't apply it across the board. Fulci did, having a background as a screenwriter, he contributed to the screenplays of a lot of films throughout the 1950s. He did write or co-write the vast majority of his films. There were only a few that he made that he really didn't have anything to do with the writing of. And one of them was actually Zombie. Zombie was not a film he was originally supposed to have directed. So that was a project he kind of inherited, and he brought his special set of skills to it. He didn't just direct traffic. But the question is Fulci an auteur? Is he not? I would argue that he is. I think you can, once you know Fulci's style, and once you know his kind of fiery voice that comes through so strong in his films, I think it's evident in pretty much all of his films. So I think there's a persuasive argument to be made for that. Certainly, I argue as much in Splintered Visions. I might as well plug my own book. Nobody else is going to do it for me. So I will say, if you're interested in reading more about him, you can certainly check that book out. There are other ones as well. Stephen Fowler's book, Beyond Terror, is another one as well worth checking out. But so essentially Fulci is somebody who has dabbled a little bit in just about every genre, even in erotica. A film called The Devil's Honey in 1986, made at a time when, for a variety of different reasons, he's not doing too well. His health is declining. He's desperate for work, so he does this kind of soft core movie that's actually quite good. It has a very interesting kind of quality to it. It's a little overbaked, a little melodramatic in a couple of scenes, but it's actually a very impressive movie. And again, a movie that I think presents a rather complex portrait of the relationship between men and women, and the whole sort of power and control, the S&M aspect and so forth. In some respects, reminds me a little bit of a very underrated Roman Polanski film from the early 90s called Bitter Moon, which also deals with the whole sort of, sub-dom sort of culture thing that goes on in very interesting ways. So a little bit of everything. But Don't Torture a Duckling is part of this group of films that he made that fit into the giallo genre. So hopefully my little talk about the giallo and what it is and why it's called that, what it entails, was clear enough. His first was Perversion Story, or One on Top of the Other, whichever title you prefer, from 1969. Then we have Lizard in a Woman's Skin, Don't Torture a Duckling. After that, The Psychic, or Seven Notes in Black, which is another film that I recommend all of it, but I think that one is very strong as well. The New York Ripper, which is probably his most controversial film and probably his most misunderstood film. I did toy with the idea of introducing that one as my title. I decided against it for a variety of reasons, one of which just, of course, is part of that early 80s period, and I think it's important to see something from another period. So, but then after that, one last movie, a movie called Murder Rock, which maybe doesn't have the greatest title in the world, and has its problems, but I think is a really interesting movie as well. So he did really, really good work in the giallo. I think as such, he was absolutely one of the very best directors in that particular genre. But Don't Torture a Duckling is, I think, the best of his giallo films. And I would argue it's the best of his films altogether. I think it is by far his finest work. I could rattle off a couple of other titles that are up there as well. Certainly Beatrice Cenci, which is a kind of historical movie that he made also in 1969. Really terrific film that is unfortunately not terribly well known, but what a movie it is. Very passionate and powerful film. And those are adjectives I would apply to a lot of Fulci's films. There's a lot of fire in Fulci's films, which I think, having sat through several of these now in fairly short order, you probably are well aware of that. But also New York Ripper, I would put up there very high as well. But Don't Torture a Duckling, I think, is definitely his best. It was actually shot, by way of a little bit of background in terms of the filming, It was made in May to July of 1972 and then released on the 29th of September 1972. That's pretty fast turnaround as far as post-production is concerned, but that's really not that unusual when it comes to these movies. What is unusual is that he had as much time as he had to make this film, and I think the fact that he had more time and he had more money is very evident on the screen. This is a movie that regardless of what you think of it, you may have issues with its plot, you may have issues with its characters or whatever, its construction, but I think technically we would be in agreement. It's a beautifully made film, gorgeously shot by Sergio Tafizzi, and featuring an absolutely fantastic soundtrack by Rizzo Ortolani, which again, Giallo films in general are revered for their soundtracks, and rightly so. I can think of a number of Giallo films that weren't very good that have great Giallos, great soundtracks, but I can't think of any really, any good or great Giallo films that don't have great scores. It's inconceivable. The music is always fantastic in these films, and this is no exception. After that, prior to that, I should say, he had made Lizard and Woman's Skin in the summer and fall of 1970, followed by a movie called The Eroticist. That's an interesting title. It's called The Eroticist in English, which makes you think it's probably a ripoff of The Exorcist. In point of fact, has nothing to do with The Exorcist whatsoever. It's sort of political satire that actually landed Fulci in some trouble in Italy because of its criticism of the Catholic Church and also the Italian government. So there was a period of time where Fulci was on sort of thin ice. There was also a little bit of controversy about this film as well, and indeed also with Lizard and Woman's Skin. As a matter of fact, in terms of Fulci nearly landing himself in jail, he very nearly did when it came to Lizard and Woman's Skin, because there's a sequence in the film which is a very surreal and strange sequence where the heroine, played by Florinda Balkan, who is also very memorably featured in this film, as we'll talk about shortly, wanders into a sort of experimental lab where there are these eviscerated dogs. Don't worry, Fulci did not actually hurt any animals in the making of that film, or as far as I know, any of the other films he made. But they were very convincing puppets by Carlo Rambaldi, who of course later went on to be involved in films like E.T., Alien. He was brought into court in Italy on charges of animal cruelty, and was very nearly in some very serious hot water until Carlo Rambaldi showed up with the fake dog puppets and was able to prove to everybody's satisfaction that no animals were hurt. This was just a really convincing special effect. So controversy was not by any means rare with Fulci. As I said, it was something that he courted and something that I think he really enjoyed. Although in that particular case, I'm sure he didn't really relish the idea of going to jail over something like that. But after this film, what does he make? He makes a version of White Fang, the Jack London staple, which he shot in the summer of 1973. So there you go. Talk about eclectic, going from a giallo to a kind of sexy political satire to another giallo to what is nominally a kind of family movie, although it does have its elements of Fulci violence and sadism in it. So it's a very unusual kind of family movie indeed, but well worth seeing, as indeed are so many of the other movies that I've been name checking. Again, this is a filmmaker whose body of work is just incredibly diverse and very, very interesting. And I think one of I was sort of saying before, the ability to go from genre to genre while still retaining that kind of authorial quality is one of the things that is very, very interesting to me about his films. So hopefully that would prove to be the case with any of you, if you should choose to go on and look at anything else that he's done. In terms of where the film was shot, obviously this is a very distinctive film visually, and rather a not completely unique, but very unusual film in the giallo, in that it is a regional film. Not only is it a regional film, it's also a very specifically Italian film. A lot of giallo films, especially the ones that Fulci made, were set in other countries. Lizard and Woman's Skin was set in England, and with the exception of The Psychic, which is also set in Italy, albeit more kind of conventional, kind of urban settings. The other films are set in America. New York Ripper, of course, title gives it away. But you know, all the other ones as well. Perversion Story is set in San Francisco and so forth. But this is also, it's not just an Italian set film, but it's set in a very regional setting, which is unusual for Giallo films because very often these movies deal with kind of wealthy, affluent um, individuals who are not the nicest people in the world. Very often they are driven by avarice and by greed, and they have their kind of kinky sexual peccadillos that come out, and they don't tend to be set in these kinds of impoverished environments. But this is very interesting. The movie is set in a place called Achendura. There's no such place, but the actual setting itself is something that Fulci said, and I have a quote from him that I'll read to you very shortly. Is specifically very Italian and something that really does exist, or it certainly did at least exist at that time. The locations were Matera and Monte San Angelo, both located in southern Italy. Matera, interesting enough, had been a location earlier on for Pier Paolo Pasolini's film, The Gospel According to St. Matthew. But then later on, Mel Gibson used it for part of The Passion of the Christ. So there you go. If you want to have a really interesting kind of faith-themed triple bill, you can have Pasolini, Gibson, and indeed Lucio Fulci, because as we've seen with Don't Torture a Duckling, it deals with religion as well, albeit in a perhaps slightly less sympathetic way than the other two films. These were areas that actually were pretty much like what you see on screen. They were kind of backward areas, somewhat sparsely populated and untouched by time. And that's one of the reasons that Fulci emphasizes so much that emergence of the sort of highway that's winding through the scenery. It's that element of the modern world that's encroaching on an area that otherwise is kind of untouched by time. It's a little bit like what Sergio Leone did in Once Upon a Time in the West, with the whole theme of the railroad coming in and the end of the Old West, certainly the fantasy of the Old West being destroyed in the process. So this is a film that's actually set in a very rural setting. Again, not completely unique when it comes to gialli. There's another very fine film by Pupi Avati called The House with the Laughing Windows, which is also set in similar kind of quote unquote backward kind of community. But you don't tend to see that in most of these films. And there's a clue as to why that happened with the quote that I have here from Fulci, which I'll read to you now. He said, and I quote, "Outside of a native audience, the people in Don't Torture a Duckling may seem a little far-fetched, but this is how it really is. Commercially, I learned a lesson. To succeed with horror films overseas, I had to de-intellectualize them. Once my films stopped making sense, they made money overseas. A Duckling made sense to me. That is my favorite of my own films." So there you go, straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And this was indeed one of two films that Fulci would repeatedly refer to as movies he was very, very proud of. The other one being Beatrice Cenci, which I mentioned before. Beatrice Cenci is based on a real historical incident. It had been filmed before by Riccardo Freda. You'll remember I mentioned him earlier. He made that very unusual giallo, Iguana with the Tongue of Fire. Not one of his better films, but he did make some really fine films, including some gothic horror films in the 60s with Barbara Steele that have a tremendous cult following, like the horrible Dr. Hitchcock and The Ghost. But it had also been adapted as a stage play by Antonin Artaud, who of course is a big influence on Fulci in many respects. He often referred to The Beyond, for example, as an Artaudian film, which is this idea of a film that just sort of revels in cruelty and strips away all kinds of logic and so forth. So his comment about once the film stopped making sense, they started making monies. Yes, there's a lot of truth to that. It is this sense of throwing as much at the audience as possible in terms of sensory stimulation and overload, as much violence and viscera and gore and sensationalism as possible. And so the films, regardless of their language, they would play in most any context. And obviously there was some truth to that. I mean, these were films that traveled. They traveled really well, whereas Don't Torture a Duckling did not travel. Don't Torture a Duckling did okay business in Italy. It wasn't a huge hit. It didn't compare with what Argento was doing at that time. It wasn't as successful as Argento's first three gialli, which had come out in 1970 and 1971. But his commercial sort of favor was found later doing films like Zombie, City of the Living Dead, Gates of Hell, movies like that. They could travel a little bit better because Don't Torture a Duckling is so specifically Italian, and because it doesn't really have, let's be honest, if you're not an Italian or at that time a European audience in general, most of the actors in this film would not be known to you. Whereas in an Italian context, this was kind of a starry cast. You have Tomas Milian, who is actually a Cuban actor who had been part of the actor studio. He ended up going to Italy and working with people like Visconti and Antonioni, but he also had a lot of success doing spaghetti westerns and poliziotteschi and doing a lot of films with people like Umberto Lenzi. And he did 3 films with Lucio Fulci, and I'd say probably his 3 best films. He was in Don't Torture a Duckling, Beatrice Cenci, and For the Apocalypse. Tomas Milian plays the character of Andrea, the journalist in the film who kind of launches his investigation. Kind of a typical giallo trope. There's usually the amateur detective. These films don't typically focus on the police because, as Hitchcock always used to say, people don't go to the police in his movies because they're boring. We do get a lot of the police in this film, though, and not entirely unsympathetic either. I mean, for somebody who had this sort of anarchistic streak to him, he's not necessarily interested in completely condemning the police. You get a kind of interesting mixture of people in this film who are sympathetic and unsympathetic, people who are backwards and ignorant, and people who actually have some compassion and some empathy. But on the whole, it's a fairly bleak movie, and I think rather a heartbreaking movie as well. We're going to get to a sequence here in short order that I'd like to talk about that certainly sums that up very nicely. But in addition to Tomas Milian, Florinda Balkan, who I already mentioned, she had played the lead in The Lizard and Woman's Skin, and in this film she plays Machara, the poor, half psychotic woman who is a witch, and she's regarded as an outsider and a weirdo and so forth, which sets her up as the ideal scapegoat for the murders. Barbara Boucher, who plays the character of Patrizia, the kind of kinky, spoiled, rich girl from the city who is kind of, she's emblematic of a kind of a monetary and moral kind of corruption that exists outside of the small community and is very present in the city as well. Fulci's take on people in general is certainly not terribly sunny, and certainly not something that you would describe as upbeat or optimistic, but there is a humanity that comes through in his films. And I think, one of the big things that makes that very clear is a sequence we'll be talking about in just a moment. I think if you watch the film and you're sitting here listening to me, obviously you have the big sequence that is the chain whipping sequence, the sequence of kind of martial law that's enacted, where the poor character of Machara is targeted by the locals because she's not like them, she's different, she's an outsider. And it's a scene that's simultaneously shocking and even a little bit disgusting in some respects, but is also deeply, deeply moving. And I think that is very important to understand, because it's one of the great things about Fulci was he was able to kind of get into these emotional extremes. It's not just the blood and gore, but there's also an emotion that goes underneath it all. Fulci's films are not just a string of kind of gory sequences. They may seem to be, in some cases, maybe that's what they were reduced to some of the later films. But a movie like this is, for the most part, not certainly wouldn't describe it as a gore fest. But it does have a couple of sequences that are fairly shocking and fairly disturbing. And certainly the central theme of the film is disturbing as well. And that's something that you don't see in a lot of films, especially during this period, the theme of child murders. That's something that you really have to handle with a certain degree of sensitivity and a certain degree of tact. And Fulci does manage to do that. We don't really have any graphic murder sequences in the film involving the children. They're somewhat elliptical in the way that they're presented, but it's still disturbing, and it's still something that I think, even into the 21st century can kind of take people off guard. But again, just to kind of reiterate, it's definitely a film that, again, fits into that sort of little clutch of movies that he made that are giallo films, but significantly, only it and The Psychic are actually set in Italy. The other films kind of had to pass themselves off as being either sort of faux English or faux American films. Again, not an uncommon thing at all. A lot of these films were set in other countries. And part of the reason for that, too, to go back to something I was saying before, is the financial aspect of these films, the practical reality of the way these films were financed, which can create some confusion. Very few of these films are purely Italian finance movies. Most of them were kind of what they call Euro pudding affairs, where you have financing from Italy as well as Germany, Spain, France, and so forth and so on, in some combination or another. And depending on the the kind of financial distribution of the monies going into these films, they could be seen as primarily Italian films, primarily French, whatever. Um, so very often you have kind of a hodgepodge of actors in these movies, and very often they were also shot in English because they were being done for an export sort of audience. They were making their money primarily overseas. That's not really the case in Don't Torture a Duckling, because Duckling, I think they were aware of the fact that because of its setting and so forth, this was probably going to have a better chance in Italy. But a lot of the films were shot in English with the actors either reciting their lines phonetically or, because they were actually fluent in it. But you would have a mixture of actors, Italian actors, Spanish, French, and so forth and so on. Not unusual to have a French leading man, for example, sharing a scene with a Spanish leading lady, and a German actor, sometimes all speaking in different languages, which obviously can make things a little tricky at times. But the people who worked in these films understood that and knew how to make it work. And certainly, again, it's one of the big, I guess, stumbling blocks that a lot of people have with Italian films is the dubbing. And that's something I want to touch on briefly as well, because there's this kind of conception that there's an original soundtrack. You're a good cinephile if you watch these films in Italian with English subtitles. The truth of the matter is, it doesn't really matter much, because these films they weren't shot silent. That would be crazy. But they were shot with rough dialogue tracks, which is to say, they would get enough of a recording that they could go back into the studio later on and completely revoice it, but they knew what the actors were saying, so they didn't have to guess at it. So there would be kind of a rough dialogue guide track, but they weren't really shot with the kind of conventional Hollywood style of worrying about, is there's a plane flying overhead, we've got to stop. They didn't worry about that. That's one of the reasons that the Italian films are as visual as they are. They were able to get away with a lot of really elaborate camera movements and really interesting kind of location work and so forth, because it didn't matter. They were going to revoice it anyway. So Don't Torture a Duckling, whether you watch it in Italian or you watch it in English or German or any other language, it's a dubbed film. Personally, I think the English soundtrack on this film is quite passable. Unfortunately, the children are not dubbed particularly well, although I think they fare better than poor Bob in House by the Cemetery, which I won't bore you by getting into that too much. Although, in fairness, the little boy in that film actually, I think, gives a very good performance. They did a bad job with the dubbing, which isn't his fault. But for the most part, the English dialogue works perfectly well. So if you watch the film in English, it's not a bad way of watching it. On the whole, the Italian track might be a little bit better, but it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. It all depends on what you're comfortable watching. You don't have to feel like a bad cinephile. If you prefer watching these films dubbed in English, it's quite okay. But in terms of Fulci's, and let me take a brief drink here. This is not J&B, or I get too froggy. Fulci as a craftsman, Fulci as a stylist, Fulci also as a storyteller. The big sequence in the film, as I was saying, is undoubtedly the death of Machara, the really heartbreaking, shocking, and horrifying sequence that I think anybody who's ever seen the film will remember. Whether they like the film or not, you're going to remember this sequence. Earlier in this series, you got to see a film called The Gates of Hell, or City of the Living Dead, which I've already referred to a couple of times. Probably my favorite of Fulci's supernatural horror films. It has a wonderful kind of effortless surrealism and dreamlike quality to it that I think none of the other films quite manages to do as well. But in that film, there is a sequence where another character named Bob, I think everybody in Italy thought that everybody in America is named Bob. Although in fairness, whenever we have characters in American films that are Italian, they're usually Mario or Luigi. So, what's good for the goose is good for the gander as well. The character of Bob is another outcast, another weirdo who doesn't fit in. And he's being blamed and accused of everything that's going wrong in Dunwich because, well, that's what you do. The weirdo guy that lives in the shed outside of town who has a blow-up inflatable sex doll, he's got to be the guy who's responsible for all these horrible things that are happening, right? It's the only person. And it's his sequence where he's attacked, of course, is another very visceral, very brutal, nasty sequence that Fulci is notorious for doing. He would later describe that scene in particular as his sort of plea against a certain type of fascism. Now you might listen to that and think, he's pull the other leg, it's got bells on it or whatever. I mean, he's just trying to somehow justify. Actually, it makes perfect sense, and it's something that is very present in a number of his films, certainly very present in this particular sequence, because you're dealing with a scene of mob violence. You're dealing with the whole concept of ignorance, superstition, prejudice, bigotry, everything, all the nasty attributes of the human race, which we see all the time. All you have to do is pick up a newspaper or turn on the news. Horrible things like this happen all the time, unfortunately, where a person is being targeted, being picked on, being attacked because they're different, they don't fit in, they don't have the, they don't have the benefit of coming across like nice, normal, stable people. And that's very much the case in this sequence. It's incredibly vicious. Obviously, it also anticipates later sequence, the opening of the Beyond, the whipping. Anybody can see that. That's obviously something that Fulci realized had an impact, so he did it again. He would do a lot of things over and over again if he knew that it worked. Ocular violence, violence to the eyes. See that in a lot of his films because he knew it was effective. But not only is it viscerally effective, it's also incredibly heartbreaking. And it's the fact that we're dealing with a character who is clearly mentally ill. She is not well. She needs compassion. She needs understanding. She needs a little bit of empathy. And what does she get? She gets cornered in a graveyard by a group of local yokels who are undoubtedly a little bit high on the local grape, and they proceed to brutally murder her. What's even worse is the fact that she manages to pull herself up towards the local, the highway. Again, this symbol of civilization cutting into this backwards community. And people see what's going on and they just completely ignore her. They let her die on the side of the road. It is a sequence, not to oversell it too much, but I think it brings tears to the eyes. I think it's incredibly powerful. It's brilliantly shot. It's brilliantly edited. And the use of music, again, Rizzo Ortolani's great score, but also using this kind of mixture of aggressive rock and roll music. You get a piece called Crazy, performed by a group called Wes and the Airedales, which, if you want to do Giallo 101, there's an Umberto Lenzi movie from the late 60s called Orgasmo, which has a song very memorably featured in that film by Wes and the Airedales. So, and there's all these kinds of little connections you can make between these movies, but I won't bore you with too much of that. But it is ultimately sort of the theme of it is really underlined by Ortolani's song Che giorni insieme a te, which translates as Those Days Together with You. Beautiful, beautiful song performed by Ornella Vanoni. And it's just an absolutely astonishing sequence. I think really, if anybody has any questions as to Fulci's abilities, his skill as a craftsman, his ability to kind of create and not only suspense, but also shock and a great deal of empathy in the viewer, I think that's the sequence that I would pick. It certainly stands out very memorably to me. And I mean, it's such a remarkable film, and really from beginning to end, there's so much great stuff in it. And I hope that everybody who watched it at least found it interesting. I don't necessarily expect you to share my enthusiasm completely, but I do think, again, it is the finest film that he ever directed. I can definitely understand why he was as proud of it as he was. And unfortunately, when he passed away, it was a film that was still at that point, I think, somewhat forgotten. So I wish he would have lived to have seen how rediscovered not only this film was, but also Beatrice Cenci, another film that he was very proud of. Have been somewhat rediscovered and somewhat quote unquote rehabilitated in the eyes of critics who, up until that point, if they've only seen really also bad versions of the popular horror films, bad transfers that don't do the cinematography justice, censored and so forth and so on. If people had an opportunity to see some of these films and get a sense of the full scope of his talent and his abilities to work in all these different genres, again, always bringing his very distinctive style and personality to bear on it, I think that would be enough to, make a very convincing and very compelling argument that he was, at the very least, a great filmmaker. And at his very best, I think not only equal to Dario Argento, but somebody who could compare well with a lot of the kind of art house, critically sanctioned filmmakers of the period. Franco Nero, who I mentioned before, the star of Django, told me, a little bit of name dropping there, but he told me, whether it's true or not, he said that Elio Petri, who is a very serious, well-regarded filmmaker, famous for films like Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion, which won the Best Foreign Film Oscar in 1970. He said that Petri made a comment to the effect that Fulci was probably the most talented of all of them at that particular time. So take that with a grain of salt, if you will. But I do think that a film like Don't Torture a Duckling, if you're only familiar with the later sort of deliberately loosely plotted horror films, to see a film like this that actually has a compelling story arc, I think it works very well as a mystery. I think it works very well as a thriller, but also works extraordinarily well as a drama. And I guess I've rambled on long enough, so I should turn it over to any questions that anybody might like to ask me.
Thank you so much, Troy. I'm actually especially happy that you went into Fulci as auteur, because when we started this weekly discussion series, a lot of the jumping off point was, like the filmmaker of the month as auteurs. And we've kind of wandered away from that. But I was glad to get your thoughts on that. And just in terms of like theme, well, not theme so much, but like directorial flourishes from movie to movie. You've talked a lot about like depictions of mistrust of outsiders, or like religious imagery, serious gore effects a lot of the time, which we see in Don't Torture Duckling, despite not really being a horror film. But then we get like so many eye pokings, which have come up in past discussions, and maggots. He's a big fan of maggots. But yeah, I think there's a lot. It's a rich mind, the Fulci auteur thing. So our patrons, please do put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. We've got time for a few here. I'll start off with one from Scott Bradley, which actually mirrors one of the questions I had that I was going to pose myself. So Scott asks, I think that horror films can't help but comment on the social anxieties of the time that they are made. Don't Torture a Duckling has a lot to say about mob mentality, superstitions, and the influence of religion and government to allow abuse of the innocent they purport to protect. Was this film commenting on anything incendiary happening in culture around 1972 that you know of?
I don't know of any specific cultural events that were going on, but I do know that Fulci described himself as somebody, obviously came from a background in a very Catholic country. He came from a Catholic background. He described himself as somebody who he believed, although he had doubts, and he was very conflicted about religion. Certainly, you see this in movies like Don't Torture a Duckling, Beatrice Cenci, and The Eroticist, which I mentioned before. There's a lot of sort of poking and prodding at the Catholic Church and so forth. Early 70s, there was a lot of things going on in terms of, social unrest, bombings, various different acts of domestic terrorism, things like that that were going on, which were reflected in a lot of the Poliziotteschi films that were being made at that time. The various different sort of notorious incidents that were taking place, and random acts of violence and so forth were spilling over into the screen as well. So I think Fulci was just in general very interested in kind of exploring the whole concept of how awful people could be. I think that was something that really genuinely interested him. But it's not just dwelling in the horrible aspect for just the sheer hell of it, so to speak. he does also, I think, manage to find humanity. So I was saying before about the police, you have, you know, you have some policemen in the film who are depicted rather unsympathetically, very flat. But then, like the local chief of police doesn't come across as a bad guy necessarily. The police commissioner who comes in from the city has kind of idealistic ideas, but he's ultimately sort of ineffectual. So he's trying to give a more fair and full spectrum, I think, while at the same time making it clear that ultimately he thinks that people can really just be really, really awful.
Well, yeah, that was one thing that struck me. I rewatched the film for the third time in the past couple of weeks last night, but on last night's viewing, it seems to me that if this, like more or less this exact film were made in America and released in America now, but it's just this film, I think people would assume that it was commenting on like QAnon. And if it had been made, 20 or 30 years ago, people would assume it was commenting on satanic panic. Like there's something sort of evergreen again about its themes. But yeah, I had the same question that was asked by Scott about like the cultural climate of the time and if he was commenting on anything specific. So I'm glad that came up. We've got another couple of questions, but I was going to ask one of my own if you don't mind. If you don't, it's kind of a biographical question in terms of your biography, but I couldn't help but wonder. In your commentary for The House by the Cemetery, you mentioned that when you were a child, you saw a still from the opening of House by the Cemetery of the murdered boyfriend, and it horrified you. Like it was something close to a traumatic experience, seeing something that graphic as a child. But then here, at least from an outside perspective, it seems like you've built like a very strong career on horror movies. For the record, of Troy's many commentaries, he has commentaries on stuff like Howard Hawks's The Outlaw or the Selznick production Portrait of Jenny. It's not exclusively horror, but you've written a lot of books on horror. You've done a lot of commentaries on horror. I'm curious how you got from point A to point B. Was there an early seed planted when you saw like the stills from the horror movies as a small child, and like at what point did you turn a corner on it?
My and this will seem a strange answer. My maternal grandmother died when I was 2 years old. And she made a comment to my mom that he likes this stuff because you were watching things like The Omen when you were pregnant. I was 2. So obviously, I mean, I must have come out of the womb liking art. I don't have that seminal moment. I kind of wish I did. I wish I could say, oh, it was because I watched Dracula, Prince of Darkness, or I watched, I've always loved this stuff. But there are levels. And obviously, as a child, I grew up on old movies. I've never discriminated against films based on, oh, it's in black and white or the acting is, I've always sort of embraced old movies. So as a little kid, it was sort of the Universal films and the Hammer films. But even Hammer films were a little too intense for me when I was little. And it kind of gradually got into that. And then from there, built up my tolerance and finally came to people like Fulci. So, yeah, I mean, the first Fulci movie I ever saw was actually a relatively mild one that he did in the early 80s called The Black Cat. Which actually used to show up on the USA Network in the 80s. So, and that was long before I knew who he was. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a seminal moment when it comes to horror films in general. I can say that Mario Bava was my gateway to Euro horror in particular. Having seen Baron Blood when I was very, very young, that made a vivid impression on me.
If at any point you start running out of time and want me to shut up, don't be shy. Just tell me to stop asking questions. But they're starting to really come in now. It seems like once the first question's asked, we always get like $100 ones. Let me see. I guess related to what we were just talking about, you kind of already answered, but I thought I'd give you a chance to follow up. Dr. AC from a couple of weeks ago was curious about what personally piqued your interest in Fulci specifically, and such that you were interested in exploring beyond the usual suspects, zombie, gates of hell, etc.
I think I just have a strange compulsion in general. I seem to just gravitate to certain directors at certain times. I'll give you a perfect example. Right now, I'm watching David Lynch, and I've been well aware of David Lynch for many years, and for a long time, I really didn't care for him because I thought, oh, it's just weird for the sake of being weird, and it didn't do anything for me. And now all of a sudden I find that weirdness is working for me. So I'm kind of, I'm immersed in Twin Peaks right now. Many years after most people have watching, I'm finally watching it. And I understand now why people are so fascinated. It's like that with so many different directors. It was like seeing The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, because Christopher Lee was in it. Christopher Lee is my favorite actor. Seeing Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, falling in love with that. I wanted to see everything Billy Wilder directed. So I'm checking out all the Billy Wilder movies. I recently did a bunch of Bergman movies and so forth. With Fulci, it was kind of inevitable once I started digging into his movies and realized how good a director he really was. Seeing things like, good quality versions of movies like Zombie and also Lizard Woman's Skin, I realized I want to see everything that I can. So, and I ultimately decided to write a book about him. I knew that I didn't want to fall into that trap where I was only going to talk about the popular movies. I wanted to talk about all of them. So it's always like that. It just seems like it just takes that one movie that kind of captures my interest and my imagination, and then I want to see everything.
I don't mean to get all film professor on everybody, but I see we've got a few of Webster University's film students in the audience tonight. I wanted to venture, I think that is a great compulsion. Like, that's the way to lead into a career in film, is you just get obsessed with things. Like, don't worry about, I don't know. Yeah, so like you see one film by a director, you like see all of the films by that director. I think it's a good road to go down.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of along the same line of questions, I think, you mentioned in the commentary for Don't Torture a Duckling that it didn't get a theatrical release in the United States at all. It didn't surface in the United States until I want to say 1999, at which time it got a VHS and DVD release. I'm curious about your first, since you say this, you claim this as his best film and you're kind of the Fulci expert. What was your first experience with it? Like, how did you see it? Where did you see it? Like, where in the timeline? Like, how deep were you into Fulci before you were able to experience this one?
Again, I don't know how interesting this will be to anybody. There, in around 1996, 1995, I graduated from high school. I decided to take off a year, and before I went on to college, because I just I wanted to take some time. And during that year, I worked, and because all my friends had kind of splintered off and gone off to college and so forth, I really didn't have a lot to do. So I was making money, and I was spending it on movies. And I was getting, at this time, there were these different gray market VHS outlets where you could get copies of rare and unusual films. And that was during that period I got hardcore into Mario Bava, and then from Mario Bava went into Dario Argento, and then Lucio Fulci. I remember buying tapes of Zombie and the Gates of Hell, and then tapes of Lizard Woman's Skin and Don't Torture a Duckling. So that was how I first saw it. It was from I think it was a Greek. It might have been Greek. I can't remember, VHS. So it was partially in widescreen. It had burnt-on subtitles at the bottom, but it was the English dub. And I have to admit, the first time I saw it, I wasn't like totally nuts about it. I much preferred Lizard Woman's Skin at that time. But eventually, it became opposite. I mean, I love Lizard and Woman's Skin, don't get me wrong, I think it's wonderful, but Don't Torture a Duckling eventually became my favorite. So it was just during that period of time where I was just sucking up everything that I could and buying all the films that I could. I just, I knew of that film because it had been reviewed in the Encyclopedia of Horror Films, which was a big, important book for me in terms of my interest in wanting to write about movies.
We have a quick comment from Charles Jacobson. It's not really a question, but on the subject of police in Italy, he says the depiction of police in perfect dress and taking no action I can attest to from actual experience in Rome. So I guess it's accurate in that regard. Another question from Scott Bradley is if Fulci is akin to Artaud, theater of cruelty, where there is an assault on the logic of surrealism as well as disturbing imagery, do you feel like Tobe Hooper also fits that mold?
Oh, yes. Tobe Hooper is as close as we ever had in America to a Lucio Fulci type director. Nobody could do the kind of hysterical horror that Tobe Hooper did as well. That really, really wonderful run of movies he did up until and including the second Texas Chainsaw movie. That was an amazing thing. Yeah, there's definitely kind of a kinship there. and also a propensity for kind of the bizarre, the surreal, and the nonsensical, which in Fulci's case in particular, I think for a long time, unfortunately, because critics don't tend to take these types of films very seriously, they just had this idea, I think, that the man didn't have a clue how to tell a story. He didn't know how to, the films were just nonsensical. They are deliberately nonsensical. A movie like Don't Torture a Duckling, yeah, it may have its occasional contrivance, but it actually does tell, I think, a coherent story.
I'll put in the last call for questions. I need to start wrapping up. So if you have any burning questions you want to make sure to get in before we close, please put them in the Q&A now. But for now, there's a question. The witch, Machara, being beaten by the mob, as well as the voodoo and zombie, features some kind of black magic being condemned. However, in Zombie, the magic is catastrophic, where the magic in Duckling is misunderstood and wrongly attacked. The commentaries on black magic, when juxtaposing these films, seem to contradict one another. Did Fulci have any concrete beliefs or opinions in the concept of black magic, or was it just a tool or device he used to drive his plot forwards in whatever way served him?
You have to remember with Zombie, he didn't write that film. That was a script that had been written by Dardano Sacchetti, and it was originally supposed to be directed by a director named Enzo Castellari, who specialized in zombie movies. He specialized in action movies, and he made the original Inglourious Bastards, for example. He's obviously somebody Tarantino, adores. So Fulci came onto that film once the script was kind of in place, and he more or less shot what was written, although he shot it in his own way and emphasized things in his own way. Fulci himself was not really what we would call a kind of spiritual kind of a guy. I don't think he really had any particular interest in it. I think in the case of Don't Torture a Duckling, it was very important to kind of get into this idea of religious bigotry, a kind of backwards community where people who aren't conforming to the established values, they're not, a church-going Catholic and so forth, somebody who's a pagan or a witch or whatever, would be viewed with suspicion. The rich kind of party girl, Patrizia, coming from, her background and so forth, is also viewed with suspicion. Although there's good reason for that, as we see in another scene in the movie where she tries to seduce the little boy. That's certainly something that he was interested in exploring, and it's that kind of theme of bigotry and ignorance, really.
I've got two more questions, and then I should probably wrap up. First is, would fans of serial killer movies, such as Silence of the Lambs, Seven, etc., like this film, and how come it hasn't ever broken through with that crowd?
It's interesting because Fulci, again, wasn't exactly a wallflower when it came to making comments that could be very critical in interviews, and he wasn't particularly impressed with Seven, apparently, and he kind of maintained that Seven was just pretty much a Hollywood version of New York Ripper. And he complained about the lighting being too dark. It's the library. What is that? A library for blind people? He said, which is kind of funny. But that was just his way. I think if people can get over the dubbing and understand, too, that there are, it doesn't register with me so much because I'm so used to these movies, but I think some people might have certain issues with could be seen as technical shortcomings, like with some of the special effects and so forth. I think the chain whipping makeups and so forth are exceptional. I mean, it just, to this day, it makes me wince. The finale, the dummy going over the cliff, okay, that's not going to fool anybody, and maybe he lingers on it too long, but I think he was just sort of fascinated with that whole idea of the kind of shredding of the body and that kind of, paying, the atoning for the terrible sin that this, this priest is responsible for this series of murders. It's, somehow he deserves a really spectacular death. If you're not sympathetic to that, or if you're kind of condescending to that, then it might be difficult. But I think in terms of its kind of, content and its execution, I see no reason why somebody who likes films like Silence of the Lambs or Zodiac or Seven or any number of films like that shouldn't have the ability to enjoy something like this.
Well, my experience has been that there's kind of a clamoring for good serial killer movies. So I can't help but wonder if this movie's just waiting to be discovered by that crowd. Like, look at the enduring popularity of, true crime podcasts now are such a big thing. Also, on this most recent rewatch, I thought a lot about the 90s documentary Paradise Lost, the child killings at Robin Hood Hills. I feel like, I mean, that's a documentary, but that and Don't Torture Duckling have a lot in common. Anyway, one last question from Drew Edelstein, who is a current and excellent Webster student. Hello, Drew. He says, does mental illness and neurodivergent characters play a consistent role in Fulci's movies beyond Duckling? If so, is there a deeper thematic trend to be gleaned from the ways he presents those characters?
I think in general, it just again comes down to that theme of the outsider, somebody who's different. You can point to the character Bob in City of the Living Dead. That's a classic example. Fulci definitely had a kind of an empathy with and an understanding for people who were kind of marginalized, whether they were, I mean, in the New York Ripper, for example, one of the more sympathetic characters in the film turns out to be gay, which is kind of an unusual thing for a movie at that time. This is, was not a particularly progressive period on that level. So I think any kind of character that in any way, shape, or form could be seen as an outsider, somebody who is being, sort of misjudged, or in many cases, really being horrifically treated because of the fact they're different. It was something that really interested in him. Mental illness as a theme, certainly. I mean, you can see it in many, many different films, but it's not consistently sympathetic or unsympathetic. I mean, you have characters who are presented as, really nasty kinds of characters. The villain in Massacre Time comes to mind, for example. Or you could have somebody like Machara, who, the police, the police captain at one point says, that her only crime was sticking pins in dolls. So she's condemned not because she's done something horrible, but because she represents something that is not only not appreciated by the local people, but is certainly not at all tolerated. So differences like that are to be stamped out. And that's something that he really rails against, I think, in a lot of his films.
All right. I guess so concludes both tonight's event and April Fulci's in general. Please do come back next week when we start the Satoshi Kon series with Adam Manfredi on Perfect Blue. But thank you so much, Troy. Thanks for everyone coming. But yeah, I'm especially grateful to have had you as a speaker tonight, Troy. So thank you so much for your efforts and for the bonus 20 minutes at that.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'll see everybody next week, hopefully. Thanks again.